All right, well, good evening, everyone. My name's Brian. I'm with the Eaton Fire Survivors Network, and I want to thank everyone for being here today. Really excited about tonight's conversation. It's a real issue that we're all dealing with, and we hope to get a lot of answers here. It's going to be an interactive QA with one of the world's leading experts on soil contamination and human health. Tonight, we're really happy to have with us Scott Fendorf, who is the Huffington Professor of Earth Sciences at Stanford University. Scott has spent over a decade researching how metals move through soil and affect human health, and lately he's been testing the soils right here in Altadena. In our prep sessions, Scott was talking about all the work that he's doing, the people he's been talking to here in Altadena, and he's happy to be able to be here to share some of his findings and advice with us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to two wonderful individuals here in Altadena as well. We're going to moderate the panel. So this panel is going to be moderated by Jane Lawton Potelle and Jessica Cabrera of Eaton Fire Residents United. They're going to share a little bit more about their organization as well, who's doing some pretty interesting stuff here in Altadena by creating a lot of information there that's going to be helpful for all of us as we're moving back into our homes in Altadena. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jane.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. And as a representative of Eaton Fire Residents United, we're also very excited to hear Professor Fendorf's perspective and expertise on soil testing and remediation. We're here as representatives of Eaton Fire Residents United, often confused with Eaton Fire Survivors Network. They're both a four-letter acronym, but we are part of an organization who is collecting professional industrial hygienist tests and mapping them in the communities of Altadena, Pasadena, and Sierra Madre to indicate to other residents the level of toxicity that you may be experiencing in your home. We take privacy very seriously. We only map the test results to local cross streets so that we are not indicating which home the tests came from, but your tests that you do submit help to not only communicate possible hazards to your neighbors and other community members, but it also helps EFRU advocate for our community in pursuing funding and support for those in our community who can't either afford out of pocket the testing or do not have access to insurance that will cover the cost of the testing. And as we know, it's hard to remediate properly if you don't know what you're remediating for, hence the need for testing. Thank you to all who have submitted your tests to EFRU. And if you are considering testing, or if you have and haven't submitted your tests to EFRU, we welcome you to do so. Our website is www.efru.la, and you can go to the Submit Test tab and submit your test there. Jessica.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jessica. I'm also with EFRU. We welcome you to check out our website at efru.la. And I'll be helping with some of the questions from the chat today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Scott. As Brian noted, I'm a professor at Stanford University. I've been studying the cycling of metals from lead to arsenic to chromium for the past over 3 decades now. And I'm excited to be here to try to share with you my expertise on cycling. I also want to let you know that my heart really goes out to you. Part of my position here is to try to give you the expertise that I have, but also to recognize that I too am a homeowner. I want to humanize this by saying that some of what I'm going to be trying to convey is that there's always fuzziness in some of the risk analysis. And so I'm going to offer what my opinion would be as if I'm a homeowner, given my expertise in this area. So I'll try to do that the best I can. Hopefully we can go through the questions fairly quickly so that we can try to address as many of them as we possibly can. And thank you so much for having me.
And just one housekeeping item for folks to remember, please do ask your questions in the Q&A. There is an individual, Michael, who's raising their hand. We're going to interact with the audience via Q&A, no live questions. And so please do, if you do have questions, enter them into the Q&A. Back to you, Jane and Jessica.
Wonderful. All right, let's get started. I see that we have quite a few questions tonight. All right. All right, so I'm going to identify some issues faced by the Eaton Fire Survivor Network community, and certainly by the Eaton Fire Residents United community as well. And that is testing uncertainty. Many are asking what contaminants were actually deposited by the fire and whether their lots, burned or not, require expanded testing. Survivors are unclear whether basic lead testing is sufficient or if they should also be checking for arsenic, asbestos, and PAHs.
It's a really important question to ask. So the way we would think of that as a scientist is that we look for what are the major risk drivers. And so there are a host of different metals and contaminants in general. The biggest one that we're seeing from the risk perspective is lead, particularly in the residual soils of the burned and unburned sites. In some of the indoor areas, there's been reports, which I'm not part of, but I'm hearing reports that arsenic in those conditions are also somewhat elevated when we see the soil levels. And in fact, there's the first question in the Q&A has arsenic levels listed there, 7.8, 3.5, 6.5. Those are actually quite low relative to natural backgrounds. They would be right where we'd expect. So the other metals, though, that you might think of that particularly from household burning are things like copper and zinc. Then you can move into things like asbestos, and then there's the organic portions like PAHs. We'll say that asbestos is one that is you measure it differently than you measure the metals. And so we in our testing haven't been measuring asbestos, but those that have been are not seeing particularly elevated levels from my understanding. So I'm gonna just roll with what I'm hearing from the other experts, that asbestos is one we're not having to worry about so much, but arsenic and lead are, and particularly lead. And so I'm largely going to focus on that. But if you all are concerned about any of the other ones that you might think of, so it could be arsenic, could be chromium, could be copper, zinc, I'm happy to talk about those as well. So I'll stop there and we can move on to the next question.
Okay, thank you. All right, so there's some distrust of free testing that some of our community is having. Some residents have used free services from USC or CAP LA, but remain unsure whether those tests are comprehensive or sensitive enough. Concerns are growing that these tests, whether or not these tests meet the EPA, insurance, or resale standards. Will there be a need for property owners and residents to pay for a second round of certified lab testing?
So I'm going to have to answer that in a qualitative way. Generally, you should be able to trust most of the academic labs that you would send samples to or that would work with you, even for free or not. And I will say in a unfortunate way, the levels that we're seeing and that are the standards are actually quite high. So they're not pushing any of the analytical detection limits. And there sometimes you would see that, but in the case of residual metals within fire burned areas, that's not the case. So what I'm really trying to get at is that you should have confidence in the values you're getting back if they are done reasonably well. And I would think USC has really good analytical labs. I would trust the results I got back from them. Whether or not an insurance company will accept those, that's a different question. So there are EPA certified labs, and often the insurance companies will require an EPA certified lab. And I personally don't think that that's warranted, but that is the standard. What I would say the value still for you is that if you're getting it from USC or any other academic institution, the value really comes back because that it gives you then the ability to know whether or not you need to screen further. And if you do, for example, if you did have higher lead concentrations and you wanted to report those to the insurance company, you would now know that should be done, and you could probably limit your sample and your expenditures because of that.
Okay, thank you. So many are shocked to learn that lead persists even in soil that looks clean, and that post-debris removal testing is not automatically conducted unless homeowners specifically request it. This has led to cases where families assume their yards were safe, only to later discover dangerous contamination. Can you address that concern?
Yes, and I will say that the concern is warranted. So you can't see, taste, or smell metal contaminants, so they can be deposited without your knowledge. And so I'll make this short. So you should be wary of them, and hopefully as the questions continue to unfold, I can express how you can deal with those concerns to minimize your risk. And what you really want to do is you want to minimize your risk for exposure. There's going to be a question, I think, that comes that asks, like, do they get rinsed out with the rainwater? And I'll just address that now. And the answer is no, and that's good and bad. It means that they stick on the particulate matter very strongly and they won't rinse off with the water. That means they don't go away when it rains. The flip side is that they don't like to come off the particles. So when we think about the exposure to plants or other things, or dermal exposure, you really are only going to get these into you through inhalation or ingestion of the particles. So if you can limit the dust and you can limit eating them, then you're going to be in good shape. And what I want to be clear on that, when I say eating them, I mean the particles themselves. So I'll stop there because I know there's going to be questions on, is it safe to eat your fruit from the fruit trees that are there? The answer is nominally yes, but I will answer that more fully when we get there.
Before we continue to those questions, Professor Fendorf, we do have a couple of questions on the chat that are related to what we have been talking about. So one of them is, what determines that your home is uninhabitable due to presence of lead and arsenic and nickel? We have testing results, however, insurance may not cover the cost of complete remediation.
So I'm going to have to be careful on answering that. So for indoor contamination, I can't really address that. That's not where I don't have the expertise to really give you what the safe levels are from the indoor perspective. And you'd want to work with someone that really is much more towards the health and safety and the epidemiology of metal risk from indoors. From the outdoors, I can tell you a lot on the exposure and whether it's safe to come back. And in general, it is, with the right approach to how to do that. And I think there's some questions that are going to come through about how much you have to excavate versus how much you can do with capping and what kind of materials you can use for capping. So as we get to those, I can give more fidelity in terms of how you would minimize your risk. And so for the indoors, mostly what you're going to have to do is really, and this is how we do it, just so you know, in our labs at Stanford, we are working with contaminants like this all the time, and we're having dust. And so we wear respirators, but then we have that all over our indoor materials and we clean it off. And it turns out soap and water and the sponge works actually quite well. So there is protocols for removing a lot of the contaminants. Carpets get really tricky. Upholstery gets tricky. So if your questions around that, I'd be happy to try to answer that as well.
Okay. And one more question. Can you clarify what is the proper volume for a soil testing sample? Some labs have asked for 6 inches vertical slice. Others only want the top surface sample. Will the results be artificially low and misleading if we provide the subsurface sample?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, obviously, if you go a little deeper and you dilute that surface volume, you will get a different number than if you really go off of the top. I think you should really limit your sampling to that upper probably 1 to 2 centimeters, so little half an inch to an inch or so, because that is really where your exposure risk is. So you want to really keep it at that surface and know what the concentration is across that ash layer or the top portion of the soil. What's below that can start to influence plants that are growing there, but the risk to the plants is very, very small. Your risk of exposure through the plants is very small. It's really, as I said, about ingestion or inhalation of that surface particulate matter.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to move on to thresholds and safety. Survivors are unsure which standards to trust, federal, state, or academic, and whether those thresholds truly reflect the risks to children, pregnant people, or residents with long-term exposure. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it is a really hard one to decipher because if you look, for example, at EPA and their action cleanup levels for lead, just as an example, you'll see a number often of 400 milligrams per kilogram. And then if you were looking at the California state regulations, and if you were looking at sensitive environments like schools, you'll see a number of 80 milligrams per kilogram of when action level is need to be taken. And so which one of those do you go with? Well, in part, there is state or federal regulation of what they require you to do or what they are required to do. And then there's your own exposure risk. And so what I would recommend is to go, personally, I would be going with the lower values in general, or taking mitigation efforts to make sure that I'm getting down towards those values. So in the case of lead, which I've already said is I see as one of the principal risk drivers, California, sorry, would have, for sensitive environments, would have 80 milligrams per kilogram. Remember that is an artificial threshold. So if you're at 81, you don't have to say like, I absolutely have to take action. And if you're at 79, you don't, right? It is somebody made that number. And so you need to think about the risk around that. What I would personally do is that if I'm down below 100, I'm starting to feel a little bit better about dealing with those contaminants. If I'm moving higher than that and say between 100 and 400 milligrams per kilogram of lead, then I'm starting to see my risk going up, and I would be wanting to think possibly about whether I'm in removal, in the state of needing to remove that. And if I'm above 400, then you probably need to start thinking about removing that. In any case, what you want to do ultimately is be really minimizing your exposure risk. And so that's what we're going to get to, I think, as we start talking about if you do have, say, soils that have 140 milligrams per kilogram of lead, and you're like, okay, I need to take some action. What should I do? And the answer to that is probably you're sufficient to put a top cap on it. And then we should talk more specifically about how deep and what type of top cap you would want to use.
Absolutely. I would love to hear more about that. Why don't we cover this next question and maybe we can phase into that answer. Survivors want to know if lead or other toxins can be absorbed by fruit trees, inhaled as dust, or transferred via pets and play equipment. Concerns about chronic exposure, especially in children, are rising even in yards that don't look visibly damaged. Can you address that?
Yeah, let me start in reverse order and say, for the yards that don't look physically damaged, they still can potentially have a threat. So I want to start there and really acknowledge that you should not look at it and say like, well, there's no signs of any burning here, so therefore there probably isn't any level of contamination. The particles that are carrying the metals may not give you the charcoalish look that you normally would see. And we're observing that in different places that we have been measuring. So I want to start there, and then I want to flip to the other side of that about the fruit trees and then come back to the middle of exposure to kids. So for the most part, the lead in these and arsenic, it would also be in this case, are bound very strongly to the particles themselves. And what that means is that they aren't going to transfer very easily into a plant root. So if you're watering, you're not getting lead going into the dissolve phase that would then transfer into groundwater or into your surface water or into your plants. So the fruit trees themselves, the inside of the flesh, should largely be pretty low in things like lead or arsenic. I will also add that while you can have fairly high concentrations in that surface veneer, if you were thinking about averaging across, and goes back to the sampling question we heard earlier, if you were thinking about the distribution over the rooting zone of the plant, now your concentrations are diluting out a lot. So as it mixes in deeper into the soil, your concentrations are actually going down. So I'm not going to worry about the native fruit or the fruit trees that are there, except for the fruit, the outside of the fruit, because it can get dust on it. So if I have an apple and you wash it with soap and water, I am happy to eat it. If you have an orange and you're peeling it, I'm happy to eat it. If you were growing cantaloupe this year, I would be a little bit more worried about cantaloupe. And the reason is that because it has that fuzzy exterior that can get grains that might be blowing around into that outer portion that are really hard to rinse out. It's like a carpet at that point. So now you go and cross cut it, you can be getting those particles now smearing across where you're cutting. So that's really your exposure from fruits and vegetables. It's really whatever is dust coating on the exterior of it, not what's in the flesh. Okay, so let's go further along that in terms of particularly children, but for all of you adults as well. Your exposure risk isn't really dermal. In fact, let me rephrase that. It's not dermal absorption. So you can go and put your hands in the soil and the ash and you're not going to be threatened from it. What you don't want to do, though, is have any residual of those particles on your hands or your children, because that is where you can potentially get exposure through ingestion. And then probably the biggest route of exposure risk is really from dust. So I talked with a homeowner that was interested in, well, had a really good plan of bringing in mulch to cap all of the soils. It was an unburned lot. So to put mulch across all of the yard, that will actually then minimize your wind-blown risk. It minimizes your potential for exposure from inhalation as well. But then she was very worried about lawns. So lawns, if you have a lawn, you can't really put a top cap. You could put a thin little bit of mulch on it without killing the grass. The good thing about lawns are that you don't have much wind exposure from those particles, right? They're deep down in the blades of the grass. You also water your lawn quite a bit. So let me just back up and think, like, how often do you see dust blowing off of a lawn? Personally, I don't see dust blowing off of a lawn. And that's actually a really, really good indicator that your risk from the lawn is pretty small. Now, one other factor though, I have a dog. Our dog likes to play on, we have a little lawn. He likes to play on the lawn and we throw a ball for him. I wouldn't do that if I were you. He can go out and run on the lawn. I wouldn't play ball on the lawn. I wouldn't, if you have small kids, I think the risk on that is still pretty small because you don't see a lot of soil on the hands of somebody who's playing on the lawn. But if you do, then you would want to make sure that you either stop that or you make sure that they wash their hands. You're probably not going to get a lot of inhalation exposure from that. So that's a quick kind of rundown of how I would see the yards. Last thing, I'll just say that you're right to think that children are the most sensitive receptor. They have much smaller body weight. They're going to be more sensitive to it. You also have to think about how they might be getting exposed to the particles themselves. But you can limit that, and if you do, then I think you're actually in pretty good shape.
So that leads me to ask a question from the chat, Professor. Jessica wants to know if we were talking about the 1-year-old little children. What about a 1-year-old living on a property with 89 parts per million lead in soil? Their whole street is burned down, but major street opposite from them has burned properties, and the closest burned property is about 150 yards. What do you think?
So yeah, so it's a really good question, and 80 would be kind of right at this threshold that is in terms of California standards would say like you're probably okay. What if for me with a 1-year-old, what I would do is for where I was having them play, I would have a clean mulch put down. So you could be a redwood tan bark, it could be a thin layer. It only has to be a 1/2 inch to 1 inch, let's say at most, of clean compost. I would put down that in areas where they might be going out and playing. If and that's probably it. Other than that, I would feel pretty confident that their exposure risk was pretty small.
Well, I have a follow-up question to that. Can we talk a little bit about pets? For those of us who have dogs
Yeah.
and we, need to take them out for a walk, should we have concern about their contact with the ground and what they might be then treading into our homes?
Yeah. Uh, that's a very good and very hard question to, well, let me reset. It's actually, the first part's not hard. You should be a little bit worried about that. Yes. Right. Because, I said, I have a dog as well. Walking them is not really the problem. So on that side, I wouldn't worry about it too much, especially, we tend to wipe our dog's paws off when we get back. And I think I would do that, or you could even spray it off with a hose, really, their paws each time quickly. And I think that would suffice. What I would be more worried about is that our dog loves to go and roll in everything. And he has pretty shaggy fur. And that would worry me because I don't know what the levels are where he would be rolling. So if you can limit your dog from rolling in different, if he's rolling on the street, that's fine. If you're rolling on a lawn, I would be okay with that too. If he's rolling in an open soil that you don't know has been top capped, that I would try to not have happen. So I think it is a risk factor in there, and you would have to try it to really through managing the dog's behavior, minimize that.
And can we talk for a moment about cats? We know that cats really like to clean themselves.
Yeah.
Many cats are outdoor creatures.
Mm.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah. Oh boy. Dogs are easier typically, right? Because you're with them and if you're taking them outside of your yard, you have them on a leash and you're watching them. We have a cat who is he's got to be partially feral. You cannot keep him indoors. He's going to shred you in our house. So he has to go outdoors, and we don't track where he goes. He clearly is rolling in things. That would be a tough one. I don't know really how to answer that question because like with our cat, and now that I'm thinking through it, I would love to say keep them indoors or, restrict where they go, but it's a cat, and cats are, can be pretty rambunctious and hard to keep contained. I would be worried about it, but I don't know what I would do about it.
Yeah. And I would imagine because our pets are much smaller, in fact, smaller than our kids, there is a chance for, these toxins to have an effect on their systems.
Definitely. And like the question addressed is if they're grooming themselves, they're going to get some exposure to that. I also worry just about our cat. I know exactly where he's been in the house because I have a trail of leaves and dirt usually every day as he's moving around. I would be a little worried about that. I don't know exactly how I would deal with it other than having a vacuum that I was sucking up all of those particles that I could, and then trying to keep him as groomed as I possibly could as well. And I think beyond that, I don't know what more would be possible.
Okay, thank you for that. Appreciate your.
Maybe one
James,
last let me real quick,
go
Brian,
ahead,
let me
Scott.
do one more thing on the cat, just so I'm thinking about it. As you as a collective community are probably all individually addressing this, and they're coming in and are starting to, if you will, remediate your area if it needs that by bringing in fresh mulch or compost or um, some type of top cap, then your cat starts to become more safe for you and for everybody else. So I think the risk is probably greatest now, and it will be diminishing quite, I would think, quite a bit over the next few months.
Okay, that's good to
Thank-
know.
Thanks, Scott. And we've got some new folks coming into the chat, things like that. So can you just really quickly again remind folks, top cap soil, how much of the layer should they be putting on? And then how long do we really need to be worrying about these kind of risks as you know, we're returning to our homes, whether it's now or a year from now?
Yeah. Right. Those are actually, you're adding to the questions, Brian. Those are really good ones. So how much? Well, you only have to have enough to limit yourself from it being, or anybody else from being exposed from the lead particles. I'm just going to use lead for the example for now. So a half an inch would be more than enough. Um, the thinner it is, though, the more risk that it gets scraped off, and now you have the particles underneath that. So if you have a fairly dense compost that's being put down, then a pretty thin layer would probably work quite well. If you're putting on, say, a redwood mulch layer, and I don't know why I'm using redwood, but whatever the mulch layer is, then for me, I would go a little thicker on that. And so again, there isn't any magic number other than you want to limit your exposure to what's underneath there. So the thicker the top cap, clearly the harder it is to have that scraped off and get down to the material below it. But it's not neat. You certainly don't need to come in with a foot of material to bury that down. A few inches is usually sufficient. If you have a big rain event and you see erosion, then you should come back and recap that area where you see eroded material coming in. How long does it persist? Well, those particles, if you've in the recent literature and papers, if you follow this, the New York Times and other places, they talk about forever chemicals now, and the acronym for those are PFAS. So those are organic. Those are things from Teflon and other fire retardants and so on, not ones that you would necessarily have to worry about here. The reason I'm bringing this up is the real forever chemicals are metals. So lead is lead. It's lead. It's not going away. It stays in the particles. Those particles will slowly migrate down deeper in your soil over time, but it's not necessarily a super quick process, and they don't dissolve, which is good, right? Because it means that it's not dissolving, getting into your surface water. It's not dissolving and getting into your groundwater. It's not dissolving, getting into your plant. But those particles are still there. So how long do you have to worry about it? Well, quite a long time, but they'll gradually start to, like I said, start to work their way deeper in the soil. And as they do that, the concentration will be diminished, and your risk is going down.
Can we talk a little bit about remediation? There are some questions in the chat asking about what kind of plants they can plant in their soil to help with that. If you have any recommendations for what kind of mulch compost to use.
Yeah, really good questions. For plants, there's really no plants that do good remediation. And if there are, they're ones you don't want, because you're not going to be going and harvesting those plants and taking that material away. You don't want the plant to take it up and then senesce and blow around. So, but very, very few plants in fact, there's no plants that you're really going to get at a nursery that are going to do that. So the risk from the plants is very, very minimal, and just so plant whatever you wish. In terms, mostly what you want is cover. So if you wanted to think about you put down fresh soil on a little top cap or mulch, and I'll come back to which is the best. And you wanted to have a ground cover over that, that would be great. That will then, limit it puts you another boundary layer between you and where the lead particles are. Okay, in terms of what to bring in to cap, well, partially that depends on, truthfully, on what your landscape is like and what you want it to be. And so if you have areas where you want to think about putting new plants down, then a clean compost would be great. Clean topsoil is totally fine as well. And those give you a nice dense cap, as I was describing before. And so you wouldn't need as much of that. And then if there are other areas that were exposed and you have nice vegetation going and you just want to cap that, then a good mulch layer would be totally fine. So you could bring in a redwood mulch, any type of classic ground up wood chips type material would be perfectly fine, and a couple inches would take care of it really well. So, and I'll just say on that note, like if you were thinking, like I put down a lot of mulch to limit water use, right? So that I don't get as much evaporation, really, that would be fabulous for doing both.
So we have next in our agenda remediation questions. So you have answered a few of them. This next question we have is a little more complex and does touch on some things you've already answered, but also goes into some other areas of concern. So I'm just going to read the question that we have as it's stated. There's widespread confusion about how much soil needs to be removed, whether capping is an acceptable alternative, and what materials, like mulch, compost, or gravel, are actually protective. Some survivors ask whether simple measures like watering the soil can reduce dust or lead exposure.
Yeah, the great set of questions. Let me go from the end back to the forward again. So yes, watering actually, like I said, for lawns, it keeps the dust down. And so, and if you had a moist soil, the probability of dust is close to zero in that case. So inhalation now goes away. And at that point, it really only becomes ingestion. So somebody would have to go out and eat the soil. And I don't mean that flippantly, but if you had it on your hands or somehow and got exposed, that would be the only route of exposure. Kids are typically the ones that are the most at risk at doing that. You can imagine if we go back to the 1-year-old or a 2-year-old that's a toddler, they're going to put their hands in the soil. So in that case, if their hands get the particles on them, then they would be at risk at it. In terms of now going back in terms of, we've talked about this some already, what materials would work, and it was compost, mulch, gravel, all of those work wonderfully. And so it really depends on the part of your yard or the style of your yard, which one you would want to use, but all of them will work. You just need a barrier between the top and where those particles are. And when you do that, then you've now limited your exposure.
And capping, can you talk just a little bit more about capping? Is capping not necessary if you're going to put down mulch or compost or gravel? Is it a good idea to cap? I'm sorry, capping is that, but I mean removal. I meant removal.
Yeah, sorry.
Should there be soil removal as well as capping, or is capping just enough?
Yeah, right. And there was also a question on that. If you are going to remove, how deep do you need to remove? And the answer is you don't need to if you are going to remove, you don't need to remove very much. It's really just that surface kind of ash layer, maybe if upper centimeter of soil where those particles have partially worked in, that would be it if you were going to remove. It's going to depend on two factors. One, how concentrated the material let's go again with lead. How concentrated the lead is would drive whether or not I would think I needed to remove. And then also my personal risk tolerance. So, some of this is, we're looking for scientific answers, but some of it is a personal risk factor as well. So if if you can afford it and you're not sleeping at night because you know there's lead in your yard and it would make you feel better to remove that, then you could do that. As with would I feel you needed to? No, I don't think you actually need to. That again, if you're some of the ash layers in the burned homes that we've measured are quite high. They're up 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. That needs to be removed. That is ash that definitely needs to be removed. For the yards that are unburned, we're seeing, in some cases, maybe 100 to 200 milligrams per kilogram in the very surface veneer of the soil. That for me wouldn't need to be removed. I would feel comfortable coming in and putting a top cap over it. And if I was more risk adverse, I would just go with a thicker top cap, and that's how I would approach it.
Okay, thank you.
Scott, and well, first off, this has been a really great discussion so far, Scott. You've got a huge amount of knowledge in this area. This is the most questions that we've ever had in the Q&A. So we've, as you can see, this is a topic that a lot of folks have interest in. We're gonna do kind of we're gonna change it up a little bit, do a bit of a lightning round. And so we'll try to get through as many of these questions as that we can. And Scott, if you can keep your answers as brief as possible, then we can definitely be able to hit some of these. We've got over 50 questions in the Q&A. And so we're gonna do a little bit of a sprint or a marathon here, and we'll get through it in the last 19 minutes of the webinar. So
all right, and as we dive in there, let me just apologize that I'm a classic academic. I like to give long, wordy answers. I'll try to do my very best to be brief on these.
That wasn't a critique of your answers. Your answers are extremely
self-critique.
Yeah, awesome. I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Okay, so I have a three-part question for you. Many of residents in Altadena are gardeners and love to garden either for profession and or for their own gardening needs at home. So they want to know if I'm ever digging in my yard, do I need to be wearing a respirator while doing it? They also want to know, like, will it be safe to eat my fruit a year from now? Maybe the fruit from now, like I'm washing it, but what about as it continues to seep into the soil? Will I be able to consume it? And I think that's two-part question. Go ahead.
Okay. Quickly, yes, you can eat your fruit. I'm totally confident on that. Working in the soil, if it's dry, wear an N95 mask. If it's moist, you can still wear an N95 mask, but you probably don't have to. It just depends. Again, if you want to be extra cautious, wear it. If you don't like masks, you probably are fine without it. If you get it on your hands, if you get the soil a lot on your hands, I tend to work without gloves. That's okay. Just make sure you wash your hands really well with soap and water, really, really well with soap and water. If you want to be a little bit more risk adverse, then wear gloves, and that's totally great.
Okay.
You can still work in your soil.
Third part of the question, should we be advised to stop using leaf blowers again?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, I like that answer, very direct. Property risk. Others worry about how incomplete remediation could affect future property value, especially for those considering rebuilding, renting, or selling. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I not well, but I'll give the quick answer is that I'm just going to stick with lead because that's the one I've been saying is the risk driver. So the lead particles are going to gradually be dispersing through the soil. That means their concentration in any one spot goes down. So if you're going to be selling a decade from now, I'm just going to put that number out there. It's very likely that your lead concentration has gone down by a factor of probably 10 because it's dispersed over that much of an area in the surface soil. It doesn't threaten the plants in that case. It's still locked up in the particles. The particles themselves are what are migrating down in the soil, gradually sifting down through. So my guess would be is that your property values would actually be still pretty reasonable because of that dilution factor.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, we're going to phase over to equity and community impact. So we have some equity concerns. People are increasingly worried that Soil safety is becoming a luxury, only accessible to those who can pay for private testing and remediation. Several community members have raised the issue of long-term housing inequality, warning that properties could become uninhabitable to low-income families who can't afford proper cleanup.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I truthfully don't have a really fabulous answer because I don't know the Altadena area well enough. So here, I live in the Palo Alto area. We have either very cheap or free mulch, municipal mulch that we can get. And so that would be generally perfectly fine for coming in and top capping everything. And so for the communities that don't have the same economic means, that's would be my approach, would be to try to then find some of the very low cost materials that you could then spread across your yard, and that will then limit your exposure quite well.
Thank you for that. So survivors are also worried that neighbors who skip testing and remediation may create ongoing exposure risks for others, especially in hillside areas or windy zones. With no clear enforcement mechanism, residents are unsure how to encourage non-compliant lots to act, raising concerns about neighborhood-wide health impacts. I'd love for you to address that.
That's a hard one. I wish I could give you a really fabulous answer for that. You need somebody who really understands the social side much better than I do. I would say, making sure that everybody in the community knows that there is an exposure risk, making sure that everybody in the community knows that it's actually fairly easy to mitigate with a top cap of some sort. And really using that as an encouragement for doing it is probably the best I can offer. I certainly don't know regulatory standards at all. I would, if there are hillside homes in particular that are subject to wind, and you, as the downwind residents, are unsure whether anything has been done, I would probably find Caltech or some of the other air monitoring groups that would come and do some air monitoring during a windy day. There's a lot of groups right now that are very interested in are there still particle matter migrating across. I just saw the South Coast Air Board has a whole series now of permanent stations on the western side of Altadena. And so they're monitoring regularly for this. So they will actually give you alerts. I will also tell you right now what they're seeing is that they saw a big pulse of lead spiking during the fires. It has gone back down to the natural backgrounds. So at least for the monitoring that they're reporting, it doesn't seem like there's a big risk of particle movements. If you get some really big winds, I'm not sure that would hold under those conditions. But I would say right now the wind patterns that you have do not seem to be causing concern in terms of the airborne particles, which is really great to hear.
So that leads me to ask some questions about the continuous cleanup of phase 2. As it continues, a lot of dust is suspended up in the air. Should we continue testing on a regular basis? For those who haven't remediated or done anything now, should they start now or wait? And what is the likelihood of our soil being recontaminated if we do the remediation now versus waiting?
Yeah. Trying to make this fast answer. I'm having to think through it, which is why I'm pausing just for a moment. It's likely particles are still going to migrate around while when you see dust, that means things are being suspended. Those things that are being suspended are definitely going to have particles that you really don't want to breathe, whether they're super high in lead or not. So I would be wearing, my personal exposure risk on that would be, I would be wearing N95 masks on days where you're seeing dust. In terms of the levels that you're getting into your yard, probably in that case, pretty small overall. Where I would worry about it more is on your exposed surfaces. So any place that you're going to resuspend those particles quickly, like a driveway, we're just talking about leaf blowers, coming in and blowing off your driveway after that, that's that same dust that just migrated in. I wouldn't want that. So that's really how I would consider the exposure risk to the particles. It wouldn't, I wouldn't, like I would top cap everything now, and then I would feel pretty good about that. And I would worry mostly about dust that's blowing around. Potentially, it could be dust that's clean material that's being brought in, but in an abundance of caution, I would be worried and wear an N95 mask and be trying to keep my surfaces overall pretty clean. And then you could be doing testing every so often on that just to see what the nature of those particles that are blowing around are.
So that leads me to another question. Altadena currently has some concrete crushing happening at the golf course. Residents over in that part of Altadena have expressed a lot of concern about the release of silica and further ash that collected on this debris from burnt down homes that have been transported over to the golf course and are currently being crushed for the next 10 months. Now there's some, the FEMA has, and Army Corps of Engineers has addressed the fact that they plan to do watering down of these items that are being crushed in order to mitigate the travel of the ash. But I think it's important perhaps to address these residents' concerns about the settling of any contaminants that have not been adequately contained. Is that something that residents should continue to test their soil as a result of the concrete crushing happening literally within maybe 100 feet of their home?
Yeah. Truthfully, it's a hard one for me to answer without seeing the concrete itself and knowing how much of a residue. If it's a very, very thin bit of residue that was left on the concrete, then the total concentration is quite low, mixed in with the rest of the material that they're crushing up. Hard for me to imagine that would be a big risk factor for the metals. The other question, though, was, what about the silicosis? That's probably a bigger risk that I would think. It's not one, though, that once the material is deposited, it really becomes a big issue. It's really during the crushing and the inhalation of those particles. But it's also one that I don't know in that crushing procedure and the nature of the concrete to know whether actually silicosis is even much of a concern. So it would really need to have somebody look at the particle chemistry of the crushed concrete to be able to give you an answer on that. It's one that I wouldn't dismiss, but I don't, I wouldn't immediately say like, oh yeah, definitely that's a super big risk. The metals, I think, are ones that are probably quite low.
So, oh, go ahead.
You're talking about metals. We have a few
Yeah,
questions.
I was just gonna say, let's stick to the questions in the live Q&A from here on out. And I'll turn it back to you, Jessica.
These are the arsenic level questions on our Q&A. What levels should we be worried about? You kind of gave some numbers for lead, but what about arsenic, and how do we remediate arsenic in our soil?
Yeah. Okay. Super good question. Yeah, because I was sticking with lead. Let me, again, just because it seems to be a trend, I kind of go from the back forward. Arsenic, like lead, it also sticks really, really strongly to the particulate matter. So it's not going to get into your plants. It's not going to transfer. It sits in the particles. So you want to do exactly the same as lead. You want to limit your inhalation of those, and you want to limit your ingestion of the particles. That's pretty much it for arsenic. You don't have to worry about it really getting into your plants. I'm going to give you one exception in case you ever hear about this. Because of the way rice is grown, it can get into rice, but that's because it's a flooded crop. None of you, I presume, are growing things under flooded conditions, so you're fine. Okay, what are the concentrations that you have to worry about? Right now, we're seeing levels that are down well below 20. The natural background for the global average is around 16, 17, 18 milligrams per kilogram. You happen to be in an environment that is quite a bit lower than that, and we're not seeing values that go above the global background. If you have values that move above 50, that's when you might start to be getting a little bit of concern.
So we have another question. Are there other contaminants that folks should be worried about beyond lead and arsenic? What other items should or toxins should folks be testing for besides those two?
Those are really the big two that we're seeing. Cadmium is another one, but that we just haven't seen values that show any concern for cadmium. There's a few others that I'm just going to put out there. There's quite a bit of copper and zinc. That's part of a household, right? So copper wiring, copper pipe, zinc is part of that as well, and metal fixtures, chromium as well. One of the things that we haven't tested for, and I don't want to make over too much alarm, we're just starting to move down that path, is that chromium is one that might be a sneaker that we should worry about a little bit. So you should keep your ears open for this. Chromium can have forms that are really not very concerning at all. So just as a digression, and I know I'm going to make this too long, the state rock is called serpentinite. Serpentinite has a lot of chromium in it. It is totally benign. If you're all or old enough to remember the Aaron Brockovich movie, that is a toxin called hexavalent chromium. Same element, different form. That is one that you worry about. Fire can take the benign form and make some of it into a little bit more more toxic form. We don't know how much might have happened within the Altadena fires. It's started to be measured for now. It's one that does though disappear with the rain. So on that one, your risk is probably now largely mitigated because we are post rains. Also, organic, the mulch or the compost or fresh topsoil will also transfer the chromium back to its benign form. So I think that if there was the more toxic form of chromium generated, it's probably diminishing out. But I would still want to I don't want you to get blindsided by that if you start to hear somebody saying something about hexavalent chromium, because we do need to start getting some measurements on that.
Okay, Professor, one last question that again goes into maybe three little things that can be answered fairly quickly, in my opinion. So some results are in micrograms per kilograms and others are in parts per million. Is there any way to convert these? And if so, can you give us a reliable source?
Yeah.
And then second question is about bioremediation, zeolites, biochar,
Oh,
any of that
yeah.
helpful? And lastly, how can we reduce our exposure from like stepping in our soil, grass, and walking indoors?
Great. Okay, first one's super easy. Milligrams per kilogram is the same as parts per million. Conversion is 1 to 1. So done. You got that covered. There's the same thing, just different ways of saying it. Second question was, do you need to do different remediation like with zeolites or something else? Those are used to partition elements strongly onto the solid phase. Lead and arsenic will do that naturally on the particles. You don't need to add anything special like that other than a top cap. So if you wanted to add a bunch of zeolite just because for the hell of it, as your kind of top cap layer, sure, go for it, but you don't need to. And then there was a third, how do you limit
Exposure into your home. So if you're stepping your driveway or grass, soil into the home.
Yeah. Okay. So that's where your top caps will take care of. It puts a boundary between your shoes and the contaminants. So that's number one. For the lawns, same thing is that mostly the grass, those particles are going to settle down deeper into the grass. So largely you're not going to you shouldn't have a lot of particulate matter coming in after that. So basically is get a top cap down and then you should be in pretty good shape.
So would you suggest people take their shoes off before they go inside?
Yeah, probably so. Your animals won't, but you can wipe your dog's paws off. We do that. And then for a while, I mean, I think I would say it's an abundance of caution, but it's not a bad practice.
Okay.
Well, great. That brings us to the conclusion. Scott, I want to give you kind of a last minute if you want to kind of leave us with anything, and then Jessica and Jane, if you had anything you wanted to add as well. This has been a really robust conversation here this evening. I think we've answered, at least when we kind of tie them all together, at least 50 questions that were coming in through the live Q&A. So thank you to everyone for doing that, but I'll turn it over to Scott and then Jane and Jessica to wrap this up.
So I'll just wrap it up with a couple quick lasting comments. First, I hope this is helpful. Thanks for patience and sometimes my wandering answers. Second is we're coming back to resample, and we're going to keep doing that. So we will be monitoring over time what's happening in your community, and I'd be happy to come back and answer questions again whenever it's useful for you. And third is, I would love to say, reach out to me, and you are welcome to, and I will try my very best to get back to you. But I will also admit that I get inundated a lot. So if I have fabulous intentions and sometimes really, really bad follow through. So if you do ask me a question and I don't get back to you, it's nothing personal, and I apologize. But I will try to do my very best if you do reach out to me.
Well, I just want to thank you for your thorough and very thoughtful answers to many of our questions. I'm sure we could spend a whole other hour still peppering you with more. But this has been very educational for me, I'm sure for others as well. And, as we continue to navigate these questions of toxins, I also just want to put in one last plug for EFRU. Eaton Fire Residents United has a website where we are collecting tests from folks who have had their homes professionally tested by industrial hygienists. And we are mapping that information to a map that we are sharing with our legislators, as well as with the wider community, to help not only let folks know who don't have the means to test through their insurance or out of pocket, but also to advocate for funding for those folks who don't have those means, as well as to address our public spaces like our schools and our libraries and our parks. So thank you tonight for all of you for coming. And I really appreciate the time, Professor Fendorf, that you've been able to give us this evening.
Yes,
It's
Professor.
really my pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time. And thank you, Eaton Fire Survivors Network, for hosting this webinar.
You bet. Last but not least, yes, this will be it's recorded, and it will be on the Eaton Fire Survivor Network Discord. Thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.